The night the story truly began unfolded beneath chandeliers heavy with crystal tears, each flame trembling as though aware of the quiet cruelty about to be committed. Carriages lined the gravel drive of Hawthorne Manor, their wheels hissing upon damp stone, delivering ladies swathed in silk and gentlemen polished to a merciless sheen. Music drifted through open doors, violins sighing with practiced elegance, while gossip arrived sooner than warmth. In such rooms, reputations were weighed with a glance, and mercy was considered an indulgence. Among the assembled stood Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, the younger daughter, positioned not by choice but by habit at the margins of the ballroom. Candlelight softened nothing of a plain gray gown, chosen for modesty rather than notice, yet it revealed the quiet discipline of a posture and the restraint carved into her expression. She watched the dancers with composed interest, though every step reminded her that she had never been invited to the center of any room, only permitted to orbit its brightness. It was not bitterness that settled in her chest, but a familiar ache, shaped long before this evening. Her eldest sister, Miss Lydia Ashcombe, occupied the heart of the gathering as effortlessly as flame commands oxygen. Laughter followed her movements, light and ringing, and admirers bent toward her as flowers toward the sun. Beauty had always been Lydia's inheritance, sharpened by confidence and a keen understanding of its power. Where Eleanor learned to listen, Lydia learned to be heard. Where one waited, the other expected. Society, ever eager to reward what dazzled it, had long since decided which sister deserved to be chosen. The Duke of Ravensmere arrived precisely as anticipation reached its peak, his presence silencing the room not through command, but inevitability. Tall, austere, and immaculate, he moved with the assurance of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves in his favor. His dark coat bore the subtle markers of rank, his expression composed to the point of chill. He was spoken of in lowered voices, admired from careful distances, and measured by mothers with daughters to place. Wealth, title, and an untarnished name clung to him like armor. Eleanor noticed him not because she wished to, but because the air itself seemed to shift. She observed the way his gaze swept the room, cataloguing faces with polite disinterest, until it found Lydia and paused. Something decisive settled there, a look sharpened by approval. Eleanor felt the moment as one feels an approaching storm, distant yet unmistakable. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched glass, though her expression did not change. Years of discipline had taught her how to endure conclusions she had never been invited to influence. Introductions were made with ceremony, voices smooth as polished wood. Lydia's smile deepened beneath the Duke's attention, her head tilting just enough to suggest humility without surrender. Eleanor stood beside them, acknowledged with courtesy so thin it might tear, her name offered and accepted with equal indifference. The Duke inclined his head, his eyes passing over her as one might note a familiar painting, respectable but unremarkable. No slight was spoken, yet the absence of interest carried its own eloquence. As the evening progressed, the Duke claimed Lydia for the first dance. Applause fluttered politely, sealing the moment in approval. Eleanor stepped back, instinctively clearing space for their passing, her skirts brushing the edge of the crowd. Music swelled, and they moved together with practiced harmony, beauty and power aligned to the satisfaction of every watching eye. Eleanor watched not the dance, but the faces around it, noting how easily judgment congealed into certainty. This, they believed, was the proper order of things. Whispers followed, threading through the room like fine wire. The youngest sister was kind, yes, sensible, but lacking distinction. She would make a good companion, perhaps, or a dutiful wife to a modest man. Such assessments were delivered with smiles and sipped tea, never allowed where they might bruise. Eleanor absorbed them nonetheless, each murmur reinforcing a truth she had long suspected. In a world that prized spectacle, quiet virtue went unseen. Later, beneath the pretense of refreshment, Eleanor found herself momentarily alone near a tall window, rain streaking the glass like unshed tears. The Duke passed nearby, pausing only long enough to offer a courteous nod. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, his tone respectful, distant. No further words followed. The space between them closed as he moved on, leaving behind a silence more instructive than insult. Eleanor inclined her head in return, her pulse steady, her heart less so. When the announcement came, it arrived not as proclamation but as assumption. Lydia's laughter rang brighter. The Duke's attention settled firmly at her side, and conversations shifted toward futures already imagined. Eleanor understood then that the choice had been made without fanfare, without cruelty intended, and yet with consequences no less profound. She stood very still, as though movement might shatter the fragile composure she had cultivated all her life. In that glittering room, amid music and approval, Eleanor realized she had not merely been overlooked. She had been measured, weighed, and found wanting by a man who would never know the depth of what he had passed by. And as the Duke smiled at the sister before him, certain of his decision, fate quietly turned its gaze elsewhere, preparing a reckoning none of them could yet foresee. Beyond the windows, the rain thickened, blurring the gardens into a wash of shadow and silver, as though the world itself hesitated. Eleanor remained where she was, outwardly serene, inwardly altered by an understanding as sharp as glass. This was not merely the beginning of Lydia's triumph, nor solely her own quiet exclusion. It was the first note of a sorrow that would echo through drawing rooms and corridors yet unwalked, binding three lives together in regret. The Duke, unaware, lifted Lydia's hand with practiced grace, sealing a future that would one day demand its price from them all without mercy. Days followed the ball with deceptive calm, yet beneath Hawthorne Manor's polished routines, consequence stirred like embers beneath ash. The Duke's visits became frequent, officially devoted to Lydia, yet his presence altered the household's gravity, drawing every eye, every hope, toward his measured step. Eleanor observed these changes with practiced discretion, noting how servants hushed when he entered, how Lydia's voice brightened, how silence thickened when he passed her by. She told herself she felt nothing, yet her body betrayed her with small, treacherous reactions. A breath caught, a pulse quickened, a gaze lingering longer than propriety allowed. The Duke spoke to her rarely, always with careful courtesy, yet those brief exchanges carried an intimacy sharper than open admiration, shaped by restraint and the weight of what was unspoken. Once, in the rose garden after rain, he offered her a book, its leather worn, its margins marked, saying only that he thought she might appreciate its reflections. Eleanor accepted it with lowered eyes, aware of Lydia watching from the terrace, her smile too fixed, her gaze sharp with sudden calculation. From that moment, tension threaded the household, delicate as lace yet strong enough to constrict, for gifts carried meanings that manners refused to name. Lydia's charm sharpened into vigilance, her questions growing precise, her laughter timed, as though affection itself had become a performance demanding applause. The Duke, bound by intention and pride, seemed increasingly restless, his gaze straying despite himself, his silences lengthening whenever Eleanor entered the room. Society, ever alert to imbalance, soon sensed the fault line, and whispers began their quiet migration from teacups to corridors, seeking purchase. The first rumor was almost harmless, a suggestion that Eleanor harbored hopes above her station, a notion delivered with sympathetic sighs and lifted brows. The second cut deeper, implying encouragement, glances exchanged, a book shared too privately, kindness recast as calculation. Eleanor became aware of the change through omission rather than accusation. Invitations delayed, conversations paused, smiles cooling upon her approach. She bore it with composure, refusing defense, for she understood too well how protest could be mistaken for proof in a world eager to believe the worst. The Duke noticed, though he spoke nothing, his jaw tightening as glances followed Eleanor, his restraint a study in controlled conflict. Opportunity came in the form of rain and haste, when a carriage mishap left Eleanor briefly alone with him beneath the manor portico. He offered his cloak without thought, the gesture instinctive, intimate, and instantly observed by a footman whose eyes missed nothing. The story traveled faster than reason, transformed by repetition, until courtesy became concealment and shelter became scandal. Lydia confronted Eleanor that evening, her voice low and sweet, her words edged with warning, reminding her of gratitude and place. Eleanor answered with calm sincerity, denying nothing, confessing nothing, her dignity infuriating precisely because it refused to bend. The Duke was aged toward decision, advised that honor demanded clarity, that lingering ambiguity threatened reputations not easily repaired. Pressed by scrutiny and pride, he chose expedience, announcing an accelerated engagement, a public seal against private doubt. The declaration rippled through the household, celebrated by some, endured by others, while Eleanor listened from the stair, unseen. She felt not surprise but confirmation, the final alignment of suspicion into certainty, leaving behind a clarity as cold as it was steady. Later, alone with the book he had given her, Eleanor traced the marked passage, its words speaking of choices made too early and truths recognized too late. She closed it gently, understanding now that the gift had never been innocent, nor the silence empty, but neither would be redeemed. Outside, the manor settled into uneasy quiet, arrangements proceeding, rumors subsiding, order restored at the expense of something unnamed. Eleanor prepared herself for departure from illusion, not knowing yet what form loss would take, only that it had begun its claim. Across the estate, the Duke stood before his mirror, fastening duty around himself like armor, unaware that in sealing rumor he had sown regret. The engagement silenced speculation, yet it amplified what could no longer be spoken, leaving Eleanor and the Duke bound by a truth neither would defend. In choosing order, he had chosen absence, and in preserving honor, he had permitted a lie to harden into history. Eleanor felt the shift as something final, a door closing softly yet decisively, leaving her on the threshold of a life altered. She did not weep, for tears would have suggested hope, and hope, she knew now, was the most dangerous indulgence of all. The scandal faded from tongues, yet it remained etched within her, shaping resolve where longing had once lived, sharpening her sense of self. For the Duke, peace proved elusive, his nights restless, his thoughts straying toward the sister he had never permitted himself to choose. Between them stretched a widening distance, filled with duty, silence, and a question neither dared ask aloud. The house moved forward toward celebration, yet something vital had already been forfeited, unnoticed by all but two. Eleanor sensed that what lay ahead would demand strength she had not yet imagined, and that this choice would echo far beyond its moment. The Duke, for his part, mistook relief for resolution, unaware that regret often waits patiently, gathering weight. Thus the household settled into a fragile calm, the engagement praised as prudent, the whispers buried rather than answered. Eleanor stood one evening at the same rain-streaked window, watching the gardens darken, feeling the quiet certainty of being unseen. She understood now that the choice made had not ended the story, only turned it inward, where its consequences would deepen. Somewhere within the manor, plans advanced toward marriage, while elsewhere a love unchosen began its long transformation into something far more dangerous than hope. Neither Eleanor nor the Duke yet understood how dearly that first silence would cost them, nor how fiercely it would one day demand its due. Fate had merely drawn breath, waiting to speak soon. Twilight gathered early that afternoon, pressing against the tall windows of Hawthorne Manor as though the sky itself sought entry. The household moved with subdued purpose, servants' footsteps softened, voices lowered, as if all sensed an approaching reckoning. Eleanor found herself summoned to the West Library, a room seldom used, heavy with old leather and dusted sunlight. She paused at the threshold, steadying her breath, aware that whatever awaited her beyond that door would not be undone once spoken. The Duke stood near the hearth, firelight carving sharp planes across his face, his usual composure fractured by tension he no longer concealed. His coat lay draped over a chair, gloves forgotten, as though ceremony itself had been shed in anticipation of something more perilous. When he turned at her entrance, relief flickered briefly before being mastered, replaced by a gravity that anchored the room. He inclined his head, polite as ever, yet his eyes betrayed an urgency that unsettled her. "Miss Ashcombe," he began, then faltered, the title suddenly insufficient. Eleanor closed the door behind her, the sound final, sealing them into a moment neither could escape. She remained standing, hands folded, posture immaculate, her expression serene but watchful. Silence stretched, thick with all that had been restrained for weeks, and it was she who broke it, her voice calm, inviting truth by refusing fear. "You wish to speak with me, Your Grace." Her tone carried no reproach, only readiness. The Duke drew a breath, pacing once as though gathering resolve, then stopped before her, careful to maintain a distance that spoke of respect and restraint in equal measure. He studied her face, perhaps for the first time without distraction, noting the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength that had never demanded notice. "I owe you honesty," he said at last, each word weighed. "I have been remiss in offering it sooner." Eleanor felt the words settle within her, staring both dread and recognition. She inclined her head, granting permission without encouragement. The fire crackled, punctuating his pause, while outside a distant bell tolled the hour, marking time indifferent to human consequence. He spoke then of duty, of expectations impressed upon him since youth, of a life shaped by obligation rather than inclination. His voice remained controlled, yet beneath it pulsed an emotion dangerously near confession. Eleanor listened without interruption, her gaze steady, though her heart beat faster with each measured phrase. When he finally named Lydia, speaking of admiration and suitability, she neither flinched nor smiled, for these truths had long since ceased to wound. It was when he fell silent again, his hands clasped too tightly, that Eleanor sensed the turn. "There is another truth," he said quietly, "one I have no right to burden you with, yet cannot deny." He met her eyes then, fully, without evasion. "I have wronged you by my restraint." The words struck deeper than accusation, for they carried acknowledgement. Eleanor's composure wavered, just enough to reveal the cost of such recognition. "You owe me nothing beyond courtesy," she replied, though the softness of her voice betrayed the effort required. The Duke shook his head, a rare, unguarded gesture. "I owe you clarity," he insisted, "and perhaps absolution I do not deserve." He spoke of moments she had thought private, glances held too long, silences charged with meaning, the book, the cloak, the restraint that had masqueraded as propriety. He admitted, with painful precision, that his regard for her had grown against his will, sharpening rather than fading. Eleanor felt the room tilt, her certainty tested by words she had both feared and longed to hear. When he finished, the confession hung between them, fragile as glass. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from within, then opened them with renewed resolve. "You honor me by your honesty," she said, "but you mistake its purpose." Her gaze softened, not with invitation, but compassion. "What you feel does not grant you the right to disrupt what you have chosen." The Duke's jaw tightened, regret flickering openly now. "I know," he said, his voice low. "That knowledge is my punishment." He stepped closer, then stopped himself, respect reasserting its boundary. "I wished you to know," he continued, "that you were not unseen, that my silence was not indifference." Eleanor felt tears threaten, unbidden and unwelcome, yet she did not let them fall. "To be seen too late," she replied gently, "is its own kind of sorrow." She drew a breath, steadying herself. "You have chosen your path, Your Grace. I ask only that you allow me the dignity of stepping aside without further confusion." Her words struck with finality. The Duke bowed his head, absorbing the consequence of his confession. In speaking, he had sought relief, perhaps forgiveness, but found instead a truth that could not be undone. Eleanor moved past him toward the door, each step deliberate, her heart aching yet resolute. At the threshold, she paused, turning back once. "Some truths," she said softly, "are not meant to change the present, only to haunt the future." With that, she left him standing alone amid firelight and regret, carrying with her a clarity that would demand sacrifice. The Duke remained, the echo of her words settling like a sentence, aware that in confessing love, he had ensured its impossibility, and that the silence ahead would be far crueler than the one he had broken. The wedding arrived draped in white satin and obligation, announced by bells that rang with ceremonial certainty rather than joy. Hawthorn Manor bloomed beneath its decorations, every corridor scented with lilies, every surface polished to reflect celebration. Guests gathered in abundance, praising prudence, admiring fortune, and mistaking grandeur for happiness. Lydia moved among them radiant and composed, her smile practiced, her triumph complete. At her side stood the Duke of Ravensmere, immaculate in bearing, his expression faultless, his heart elsewhere. Eleanor did not attend the ceremony. Her absence passed with minimal remark, explained away as delicacy or fatigue, for the day allowed no space for inconvenient presences. She listened instead from a distant room as the bells pealed, each chime striking like punctuation to a sentence she had long finished reading. She felt no sudden grief, only a hollowing certainty, as though something within her had closed quietly, conserving strength for what must follow. The vows were spoken with dignity, the kiss bestowed with restraint, and applause followed as expected. The Duke performed each gesture with precision, yet his eyes never warmed, his smile never reached its depths. As Lydia accepted congratulations, her grip on his arm tightened possessively, a silent claim reinforced by law and witness. He did not resist, though his body remained subtly rigid, attuned to absence rather than presence. Marriage did not soften him. Nights passed in polite distance, days in mutual performance. Lydia sensed it first, the lack that could not be adorned or dismissed. Her laughter rang sharper, her patience thinned, and the charm that had once secured admiration curdled into defensiveness. When her deceptions surfaced, they arrived not with spectacle but inevitability, revealed through small inconsistencies, careless confidences, and the quiet testimonies of those she had wronged. The Duke learned of them gradually, his disillusionment deepening with each discovery. He confronted Lydia once, privately, his voice controlled, his disappointment unmistakable. She responded with indignation, then tears, then accusation, insisting that his coldness had driven her to desperation. He listened, unmoved, understanding too late the cost of having mistaken brilliance for depth. What bound them now was not affection but consequence. It was Eleanor's departure that marked the true turning. She left without announcement, her rooms cleared with efficiency, her presence withdrawn as though she had never belonged to the household at all. The Duke noticed only when silence grew unfamiliar, when corridors felt altered, when the library bore the faint impression of something missing. Inquiry revealed little. Eleanor had taken a position elsewhere, modest and distant, her future redirected by choice rather than exile. Regret sharpened into urgency. The Duke resolved to see her propriety be damned by necessity. He traveled without ceremony, arriving at a smaller estate where Eleanor now resided, the air quieter, the surroundings unadorned. When she appeared before him, composed and self-possessed, he saw at once the change wrought by independence. She greeted him politely, without surprise, as though she had anticipated this moment and prepared accordingly. "I should not be here," he said, honesty overtaking rank. "But I could not remain where I was." Eleanor regarded him steadily, neither hopeful nor resentful. "Then you understand," she replied, "why I could not remain either." Her calm unsettled him more than anger might have done. He spoke then with a restraint abandoned, confessing regret, naming error, acknowledging loss. "I chose wrongly," he said simply, "and I have paid for it daily." Eleanor listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she drew a breath, her reply measured and resolute. "You chose," she corrected, "and choices endure." She spoke of dignity reclaimed, of a life built on self-respect rather than longing, of the cost of being second when one deserves wholeness. The Duke reached for her then, stopping himself only inches away, the space between them charged with everything unspoken. "I would choose differently now," he said, his voice breaking at last. Eleanor's gaze softened, not with surrender, but understanding. "Now," she echoed, gently, "that is the cruelest word of all." She turned from him, signaling the end of what could not be resumed. The Duke stood rooted, absorbing the finality of a refusal, recognizing it not as punishment but consequence earned. As he departed, he understood that love unclaimed does not wait patiently. It transforms, strengthens, and withdraws beyond reach. Eleanor watched him go, her heart heavy yet steady, aware that she had preserved something essential by letting him leave. The future remained uncertain, but it would be his alone, shaped not by regret but resolve. And somewhere along the road back to his gilded prison, the Duke realized that losing her was not the end of his suffering, but its beginning, for love denied once never truly releases its hold. Years softened England without forgiving it. Seasons passed in orderly procession, smoothing the sharpest edges of scandal and regret, until Hawthorne Manor became merely another stately residence spoken of with polite distance. Lydia remained its duchess in name, though society sensed the fracture beneath the title. Her beauty endured, yet its power waned, for admiration fades when warmth is absent. The Duke of Ravensmay aged into a quieter man, his authority intact but stripped of certainty, carrying his solitude like an invisible wound. Eleanor's life unfolded elsewhere, modest in appearance yet rich in agency. Removed from scrutiny, she discovered a steadiness she had never been allowed to cultivate. Her days were filled with purpose rather than anticipation, her nights free from restless longing. She was respected not for ornament, but for judgment, kindness, and a resilience that surprised even herself. Time did not erase her love for the Duke. It refined it into something reflective, stripped of illusion. Their paths crossed again not by design, but by inevitability. A mutual acquaintance's funeral drew them both to a country church, grey stone weathered by centuries of patience. The air was cool, heavy with incense and memory. Eleanor sensed him before she saw him, a familiar gravity stirring within her. When their eyes met across the nave, neither startled. Surprise had no place where fate was concerned. They exchanged greetings quietly after the service, voices respectful, restrained, as though speaking across water. The Duke remarked upon her well-being, noting the calm assurance she now carried. Eleanor acknowledged his courtesy, observing the gentler bearing he had acquired, the pride softened by humility. They walked together briefly beneath bare branches, their steps unhurried, their conversation careful, shaped by what had been endured. It was he who spoke plainly at last, without plea or expectation. He told her of Lydia's departure, of a marriage dissolved not by scandal but by emptiness, of years spent understanding the weight of a single choice. Eleanor listened, neither vindicated nor triumphant. She had long since ceased to imagine his suffering as compensation for her own. What mattered now was the truth spoken without demand. "I loved you," he said, the words freed of urgency. "I still do. But I have learned that love does not entitle one to possession." Eleanor felt the statement resonate, not as confession, but recognition. She replied with equal clarity, admitting that her affection had never vanished, only matured beyond need. They stood in silence, aware that this exchange marked an end rather than a beginning. Yet fate, patient and exacting, was not finished. News arrived weeks later of Eleanor's illness, sudden and severe, carried to the Duke by the same inexorable currents that once bore gossip. He came to her without hesitation, unannounced, abandoning propriety for necessity. He found her pale but conscious, strength diminished yet spirit intact. Fear sharpened his composure into resolve. She protested his presence weakly, but he remained, attentive without intrusion, offering companionship rather than claim. In those hours, stripped of ceremony, they spoke freely, recalling missteps, acknowledging tenderness never corrupted by bitterness. The Duke made no promises, asked for nothing, and Eleanor, seeing the sincerity of his restraint, allowed herself honesty without defense. When her health stabilized, clarity returned with it. Eleanor understood that survival demanded choice as much as love once had. She summoned him before his departure, meeting his gaze with unflinching calm. "What we were," she said, "was shaped by denial. What we are must be shaped by truth." He agreed, prepared for whatever truth she named. She offered him neither reunion nor rejection outright, but an invitation forged of equality. If they were to walk forward together, it would be without shadow, without debt, without sacrifice of self. The Duke accepted without reservation, aware that this was not redemption granted, but trust cautiously extended. For the first time, his answer required no compromise of conscience. They parted again, but this time with intention rather than loss. Months passed, marked by letters exchanged with care, visits measured yet sincere. When Eleanor finally returned to Hawthorne Manor, it was not as an overlooked sister nor a quiet exile, but as a woman whose presence altered the house's very balance. The Duke welcomed her not with display, but with gratitude, his regard open, unguarded. Their union, when it came, was simple, witnessed by few, celebrated without spectacle. Society observed, puzzled yet appeased, for happiness needs no permission when it no longer seeks approval. Eleanor stood beside him not as a choice corrected, but as a partner freely chosen. The Duke understood at last that love gained late may still be profound, if earned through humility. In the end, it was not regret that defined their story, but reckoning. What had been lost could not be reclaimed unchanged, yet what remained proved stronger for having endured. And as the manor settled into a quieter future, it bore witness to a truth too often ignored, that love, when chosen rightly, does not erase the past, but redeems it through courage and patience.